lecture in a 8-lecture series called Current Issues in Bioethics. Today we have with us Kathy Grenlee. Kathy Grenlee joined the Center for Practical Bioethics a year ago as Vice President for Aging and Health Policy. Her work at the center focuses on advanced directives, end-of-life planning, healthcare reform, strengthening community organizations, and raising awareness about the problems around elder abuse. From 2009 to 2016, Kathy served as U.S. Assistant Secretary for Aging at DHHS in Washington, D.C. She was appointed to the position by President Obama, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Kathy was responsible there for funding programs such as Meals on Wheels, Centers for Independent Living, and also worked on a wide range of aging and disability issues and programs. Prior to leaving Kansas for Washington, D.C., Kathy spent 18 years in Kansas state government. She served as Kansas Secretary for Aging under Governor Sebelius and held a number of other government positions. She is a graduate of the University of Kansas School of Law. Please welcome Kathy Grenlee.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. I think I have the lavalier mic. Now, I roam a little bit, but not a lot. How are you all this morning? I'm, for some reason, really excited to talk to you, so I just wanted to say good morning. I've had fun putting this together. This is not a standard presentation I've done anywhere else. I made it just for you. And given some thought to what I could tell you, and my hope is that we can discuss at least a couple of concepts today that you will remember, like forever, as you work with older people. So thank you for your attention. And let's start with the title for my talk. I don't know how many people come in and say, let's analyze the title, but could we talk about the title? How to help your patients be healthy, independent, and old. Do you find anything about this title to be a little different or unusual? And you can talk to me back. I mean, audiences are more interesting if we can do this. How many times have you gone to something where they just called it right out and used old? I mean, it's the old in this that's different. I was at a meeting recently with one of the law professors at UMKC who works on aging. She said, I'm really glad that you're just using the word old. What else could I have called this? Elderly. How to help your patients, how to help seniors age, healthy aging, keeping seniors healthy. I mean, there's all kinds of other titles I could use. Keeping seniors healthy, kind of a common one. I would never use a title, keeping seniors healthy, because I hate that word keep. It particularly bothers me. It's a clear indication of who the actor is. If you're keeping someone, then you're doing something for them or to them. I would say how to help seniors be old, but I would never use the word keep. And this is something that you will see a lot. You'll see it like when we place people in nursing homes, like it's a sentence instead of admit people to nursing home. There's all kinds of language around older people and actions with regard to our engagement with older people that motivate us as the actors and them as the subject to be acted on. Old and young have a lot in common, and they're also opposites. They both mean at base, old and young, a passage of time. They are a neutral concept about how much time has passed, a little bit of time or a lot of time. But in this regard, old and young are also opposites. They have very different meanings. And because they're opposites, and young is usually considered good, and old is usually considered bad or a pejorative, most people would not use old in a sentence. I see it as a completely neutral statement. How to help people be old. I mean, that's really the goal of your work, how to help them be old, and to call it that and not see it as a pejorative. Now, I'm 57. People who do this work, we like to talk about our age. I'm 57, and I can tell you the process of the aging body is not pleasant. I mean, there's a reason why people kind of worship youth. There's reasons why these prejudices exist. But to then take this experience of, I just can't do the same things, and project that on people as they age and devalue them is just inappropriate. And so I'm just going to call them old, and we're going to talk about language as we get started. So I'm curious about what age do you think is old? I really want you to pick a number, because I'm going to show you some different words. What age do you think is old? 65, 80? Other people? Just in your mind, I want you to know what you think. Think about your parents, your grandparents, older people that you know, and just pick a number. And because for this next slide, it'll be helpful as we talk about what is the number. Word choice matters when we're talking about older people. About 3 years ago, maybe 4, 8 of the leading aging organizations in Washington, D.C., AARP among them, Grantmakers in Aging and others, they commissioned a study to talk about ageism. They contracted with an organization known as Frameworks in Washington, D.C., that does social science research. The goal of this was to figure out how to help those of us who work in the field of aging learn about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and how we ourselves, who are very age positive, need to change our language and our approach. And there were things in there for all of us to learn, but they tested these 5 words with some of their focus groups: elder, older person, senior citizen, older adult, and senior. So which of these words conveys the most competence? Which of these people are the most competent? Is it senior citizen? Older adult? Older person? Who's the least competent? Senior citizen. I hear you all whispering senior citizen. Who's the youngest? Older adult. Who's the oldest? Elder. I think it's interesting because the word elderly is not on this. If we said elderly, we would take elder and just add 10. I think most of us would understand elderly probably the oldest on here. But there's an interesting relationship between how we perceive age and how we perceive competency. So this is what the focus groups, I for some reason brought you just tons of graphs today. I don't usually use them, but there's a lot they can say. So this is the group, Reframing Aging. Let's look at the first little bar. The most competent, I think most of you figured this out, was older adult, then older person, then senior, then elder. The word senior was seen as the least competent description of older people. Now look at the ages. The youngest were older adults, and people in this focus group thought of older adults as about 54. And then older person, 64. These next 3 are all about the same age in the perspective of the people in the focus groups. Senior citizen, elders, and seniors, about 68, 69 years. The takeaway from this study for those of us who do this work is they're recommending that we stop using the word older adult and start talking about older persons. This has been a change for me. I ran the Older Americans Act programs at the state and federal level. I have talked a lot about older adults, but it's problematic if we're describing older adults as someone who's 54. We haven't even gotten into the 60s. At least if we start at least describing people as older persons, we accomplish getting into the generation of people in their 60s, and we're still in the section on this chart that shows competency. One of the things that's important when we talk about older people is that we not other them, that we not think of them as someone else, that we really try to figure out how to bring older people into the conversation, into the room. So I thought hard about how could we today kind of keep in mind the older people that we're talking about. So I've brought you a picture of 5 old dudes. The 5 former presidents got together at an event in Philadelphia a month or so ago. And I'm going to keep referring to this slide. I want to talk about them as an age cohort and individually. So President Obama is the youngest. He was born a year after me. I think he's 56 now. George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were all born in the same year. They're all 71. And George Herbert Walker Bush and Jimmy Carter are both 93. Now, do you remember this chart? Let me see if I can go back. So in terms of how we're talking, the only person that's an older president or former president that's even on this chart is Barack Obama. I mean, he's 56, and we're talking about older adults at 57, 54. All of those other older presidents are not even on this chart. Yet they're world leaders, people we respect as elders in our community, and they are not even on here because this chart doesn't expand past 69. Here's their ages in case you want some. I did look up their birth dates. Don't you think this is odd just in terms of numerology or something? That you've got 3 presidents that are all born in 46 and 2 born in 24. We can elect people that are other ages in this, but I think this is interesting. And if you think about how you perceive their health, the age they were born is not determinative. I think we all see them differently in terms of their health. Ageism is the purpose for the study that the 8 organizations did when they contacted frameworks. And I just want you to know, as many ways as I can say it, that ageism is very real. That people are constantly marginalized because of age. Most of the time this happens in the direction of marginalizing older people. I have seen ageism in reverse. I have been in conversations with people my age, whatever you consider this term older adult would be, who stigmatize or dismiss millennials. Ageism can go both ways. As a society, because we really worship youth more than old age, it's usually directed at older people. And it comes up in such insidious ways, it's like we can't pull it out at the root. In 2015, the White House sponsored the Decennial White House Conference on Aging. And we did a lot of work with the White House, and we went around the country to do regional forums to talk about aging. We were in Massachusetts, and we were in Seattle, and we went all over the country. And the same annoying thing happened in every city. We went to 5 different cities. The politicians who came to welcome us to their community, the mayor, the governor, whoever, made ageist comments at a conference on aging. And they usually did so by making some dismissive comment about their mother. Mom would never want me to tell you her age. Somehow they all were dismissive of age, and what brings it out in people is when you ask them to come talk in the conference about aging, and then they get uncomfortable and they have to say something dismissive about aging. Institutional ageism is a major barrier to older people. The best example I can give you for this, because I'm a public policy wonk, is the fact that for people who are poor, we will pay for nursing homes for them. We will guarantee payment for nursing homes. That's the entitlement. But services in the community are optional, because we as a society have determined that really we can institutionalize people. We can put them away. Ageist assumptions about people's ability impede the realization of their civic and economic contribution. I recently joined the board of the National Council on Aging, and the executive director, Jim Furman, talks about this point a lot. What do we still expect of older people? Once you've retired or once you're in your mid-60s, what do we really expect in terms of contributions and continued involvement? It's not a good thing to have people have no expectations of you, to have really no sense that you have a role. Ageism results then in very low expectations of older people. We should change that. We should expect older people to contribute, to be involved, to pass down wisdom, to volunteer at the soup kitchen, to volunteer at the hospital, as my mother does. She's kind of like trying to do aging the best she can. But we should expect things from older people, and we don't. I think the source of the problem is we think of this as us or them. We tend to think of older people as a subcategory. Like if you were, I'm a lawyer, doing the EEO list of all the diversity classes, people of color and LGBT and all this, and we'd add older. But older is not a subpopulation. Older is a phase of life, and it's not a category. And it changes if we change how we think of it. And we talked about this at the annual dinner that the Center for Practical Bioethics had last spring. If we ask the question, what do old people need? Regardless of setting, I can ask you that. What do you think old people need? The answers in your head are about those people out there, those old people out there. But if we ask the question, what do we need when we're old? It brings the conversation into the room and really talks about the fact that this is something that affects all of us. And how do we want society to be? You all are not going to be happy when your doctors are dismissive of you when you're 70. You're just not going to be happy. And it's interesting sometimes to read literature about retired physicians who experience the healthcare system and start to understand how fractured it is, but also how they're dismissed as older people. This is the other thing that I hope you learn forever. And if you learn one thing, learn this top thing. that 65 plus is not an age. And I want you to start looking for this when you read stuff. Read stuff here, your textbooks, read things in the news, read USA Today. I want you to start watching for this, 65 plus. It's not an age. Our monolithic consideration of everybody 65 and older is a problem, and it will not serve you well as doctors to think of everybody over 65 as the same. And I think they pick it, like I put on the slide, because it's the Medicare reference point. But this is a huge range. If you go from 65 to 100, you've got 35 years. How many of you are less than 35 years old? I mean, you don't think of yourselves as being the same age as you were 10 years ago when you were in grade school or high school or junior high. I mean, this is a problem, 65 plus. And I think, I've got a lot of words for you coming out, but I think the lack of disaggregated consideration of age poses a barrier to a very specific discussion about the needs of older people as they age across a lifespan. If you really want to talk about the difference between 65 and 75 and 85 and 95, you have to see it. These are distinctly different phases of life. Older people are not all the same age. People 65 plus are not even the same generation. Here's two old men named George. They are not the same generation. George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. not the same generation. One's 71, one's 93. If you mentally think of all older people over the age of 65 as one category, you will miss the differences that are clearly evident in the current health of the senior Bush and the younger Bush. They're clearly different. I mean, we all know from having just read the news that George H.W. Bush, his health has started to decline. He's been in and out of the hospital. George W. Bush is out on his ranch, still bike riding, still chopping down trees. I mean, very different in terms of what they can do. They are not the same age. I hate this phrase, and I'm not a bashful person, and I've used this phrase in front of people who just use it all the time, but I hate this phrase, silver tsunami. It came from an economic analysis of what's going to happen in the future when we have more older people. But I think the imagery is horrible. Do you all know what a tsunami does? This is a huge wave that wipes everything away and kills it. It's like, this is not a good imagery. We should not think of older people as a tsunami. I mean, this terrible storm of older people is not right. It's a complete description of burden. Those older people are coming. They are a burden on us. I'm not naive to the economic realities of taking care of an older generation. I have administered those programs. And if we want to talk about economics, we should talk about economics, but we should talk about something other than this being a tsunami. This is a population boom. There's a reason for it. It's not the fault of everybody who's older, that there's so many other people who are older. They don't have anything to do with that. Older people add value. And the fastest way to kind of erode that is to continue to use imagery that describes in such negative perspective. So if I were to ask you to draw a picture of the population boom in this country, could you do it? Just a rough graph. If you wanted to see, it's like, tell me what you think the future looks like. Just draw it on your paper or on your computer. This is what I think. You draw this graph. Regardless of knowing the specific data points, I think people understand that we have entered the beginning of this phase when we will have significantly increasing numbers of older people in this country. That is known. On this, I wanted to use the pointer because I can. Okay, we're right in here somewhere where the graph has really started to increase. And it'll keep going up from here in terms of going from where we are now to like 80 million people or more who are older. You could draw that graph. Do you know this one? Because I think this one is really important for you to know as doctors. And so I want to talk about what this says. That in this graph, this top line here, 85 plus, is the fastest growing cohort of older people. This monolithic group of 65 plus is actually bringing us very different experience in terms of their health needs. It's the 85 plus that are growing fastest, 75 to 84, 65 to 74. They're all growing, but you need to know as doctors, you're gonna have a lot more really, really old people. And I don't know, if you ask me old, I would say 80. I think at 80 you can't avoid that you're old. So, I mean, my parents have now turned 80, and they've heard me say this for years. So that they know what I really think at this point. But 85 plus. I want to talk in the health piece, just go through a few slides. You will learn these things in medical school, and I'm not a medical person. I just want to talk about the chronic conditions that older people accumulate in this age wave as we have more people who are older. CMS has a wonderful book that just talks about chronic conditions, a CMS chart book, and talk about the percentage of Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries who have these chronic conditions. High blood pressure at 58, high cholesterol, ischemic heart disease, arthritis, diabetes. Those 5 are the leading indicators. Those are the most common. But you also have heart failure, chronic kidney disease, depression, COPD, Alzheimer's, atrial fibrillation, cancer, osteoporosis, asthma, and stroke. There are a lot of older people with chronic conditions. For those of you who ever see older patients, this will become a lot of your focus, how to help them manage their chronic conditions. And a chronic condition is not an acute episode that happens in the doctor's visit. It is a long slog that eventually could result in increasing disability and decline. It is a team effort to manage chronic conditions between the patients and their healthcare providers. 2/3 of Medicare beneficiaries had multiple chronic conditions. In this bar chart, the first one, 32%, 1/3 of Medicare beneficiaries only had 0 to 1. Everyone else on Medicare, remember now we're talking about everybody 65 plus, although there are younger people on Medicare, a different conversation. 2/3 of the people here had multiple chronic conditions. But it's really startling to know that there are 14% of people on Medicare with 6 or more. Good luck, doctors. 6 or more to help them manage. Not for you to manage, but for them to manage, for their families to help them manage. I mean, this is a significant healthcare burden. And multiple chronic conditions increase with age, and this breaks people down by age. If you just start here at people less than 65 years old, 47% of people who are 65 have 0 to 1. Only 9% of people who are 65 have more than 6 chronic conditions. But if you look at the purple chart, people who are 85, only 17% of people who are 85 have 1 or less chronic condition. 25% have 6 or more. This is where healthcare delivery will be focused for older people. This is where healthcare costs are focused for older people. This, again, from the CMS chart book, talks about the number of inpatient admissions for people with chronic conditions. And it's this last piece over here. People with 6 or more are 16% of those people will be, of hospital admissions, 16% will be people with 6 or more chronic conditions. There just aren't as many people who go to the hospital who have 0 to 1. I mean, it really is this accumulation that starts to cascade multiple hospital admissions, multiple visits, and multiple readmissions. Lots of discussion in health policy about what we do in terms of payment for readmissions. But 70% of the readmissions from this Medicare data are coming from people who have 6 chronic conditions, 20% from people who have 4 to 5. It's a lot to manage, and it's expensive, and that's where the Medicare spending is going. There will continue to be, from a public policy perspective, because of these costs, increased attention to this cohort. We will keep talking about what we can do to keep them healthy, to help them age better, how to manage these conditions. Because at this point, most of our spending, 2/3 of our spending or 3/4 of our spending, is helping people. The other major, helping people with those conditions. The other kind of wave coming is a significant increase of people with Alzheimer's disease. And this was listed in that list of 15 conditions. There are many of us in aging, and the purple section here, purple's consistent at this point on 85 plus, many of us concerned about the economic burden of so many people with Alzheimer's disease and the physical burden on older people and their families. You will talk to family caregivers who care for people with Alzheimer's disease, and their stories can be harrowing and quite extraordinary because they often are caring for someone for years and years and years, and sometimes more than one person. There's a great push in this country to work on research to figure out how to at least turn Alzheimer's into a chronic condition. And I support every dollar we can spend on research, but it cannot be the exclusive approach. We have to continue to talk about how we support people who are living with the disease now and their families. I have done a lot of work, and Terry mentioned this in the introduction, on the issue of elder abuse. And one of the things I do when I talk to people from the financial services industry is I tell them, you know, for someone with early Alzheimer's disease, they can live fairly successfully and independently in their homes and communities. They are starting to have a few problems. You have to figure out kind of how to help manage. But if you go to a community, or even if you go to a skilled nursing facility, it's not till Alzheimer's disease is very, very advanced that you have the catastrophic other impacts on the physical health of the person. Initially, people can remain at home with a little bit of support. And this poses a huge risk for people with regard to elder abuse. Of the activities of daily living and the instrumental activities of daily living, what cognitive impairment does, it changes first your executive function, the ability of older people to handle their money. And the people who are seeing this are the financial services industries in this country. What do we do now to help respect the privacy, but also understand the people who are living at home with Alzheimer's disease, some of them by themselves, are at risk for someone else taking advantage of them and their money. We have to be very careful with the interventions so they're not ageist, but we need to pay attention to the fact that we have an increased number of Alzheimer's disease and a generation. Most of the money, those of you with debt, are people, those old people, the 65 plus. Most of the money in this country is with the older population because we've been saving, and that's where most of the abuse is targeted. As doctors, I think your goal, regardless of what specialty you go into, is help people achieve old. And I don't think you talk about it that way. I doubt it. I don't know. I haven't been to med school. But even if you're in pediatrics, I mean, your goal is for that 6-year-old to age and have a life and a family and grandkids and a career, a boat, whatever they want. But your goal is to help people achieve old. How to do it. But being old is not a billable event. And the healthcare system in this country pays for episodes of care and treatment and diagnosis. We don't really value in public policy what it means to actually be an old person. Instead, we value the medical events you have to overcome to get there. Being old takes more time. It just does. And it's unfortunate that we have, and I'm not going to bash the healthcare system, it's a complicated mess, a system we need. But the billables, a 15 or 20-minute increment to talk to someone with 6 or more chronic conditions who's hard of hearing or doesn't speak English as a first language, makes it really hard to provide competent care to older people. The policies and payment, the quickness. Now, I really value age. But older people are slow. I mean, they're not still zipping around. Most people are not zipping around. I mean, it just takes more time. And part of the challenge for those of us who really implore the rest of you to sign up for aging is to make this more first person and talk about the fact that it's going to happen to all of us. We will be slower. We may swear about it, but we're going to be in there kicking. And we need someone to pay attention to us and someone to give us enough time. And this whole aspect of just being old and slower is a problem in a healthcare system that's looking at production. So there's a report, and then I want to do some Q&A. I've left a lot of time for Q&A. There's a report that came out from the World Health Organization 2 years ago. WHO is like the public health department for the world. It's based in Geneva. And they have a department on aging in the life course, and they put together this report, came to the US to do the announcement, and I was honored to be asked to help with the rollout. And because it's international, they spell aging differently, the British way. And this was, I think, a seminal report from a public health perspective as they talk about aging and health. And I have slides with way too many words on them, but we're going to read them aloud because this is the bulk of the report. By 60, the causes of disability and death arise from age-related losses in hearing, seeing, and moving, and non-communicable diseases. There's a reason why I showed you all those charts about NCDs, about chronic conditions. But the presence of those conditions say nothing about the impact they will have on an older person's life. And I was talking to my nice new friends who showed me around for the last hour, and we talked about that you all talk about this. Now, you talk about kind of what's important to a person's life and how to see the whole person and not the disease. That's essential in your work. It's essential in your work for people with any age, and for older people, since they have so many diseases, really, really important that you understand that those diseases don't tell you anything about the person's life. Often you have to get into their home and know more about their family and community to know more about their life. And the burdens of these conditions will impact them differently. The Alzheimer's disease for one person, heart disease for another person, diabetes. In assessing the health needs of older people, you have to consider those specific diseases and how these impact their trajectories of function. The seminal part of the World Health Organization report was the focus on function. You have to pay attention to what they can still do. How do they function? Atul Gawande, he's way famous, has one article that he published in the New Yorker several years ago when he spent some time with a geriatrician. And he wrote about this person who came in, and he documented all their chronic conditions, and he was having an, oh my God, what do I do with all these conditions sort of sense. And the geriatrician paid attention to the gait and said, this person is at risk for fall. It's about ambulation. We've got all these other chronic conditions. We're going to have to fine-tune the interventions from medical side. But the issue for his patient in that setting was that a person's ability to ambulate was at risk. You have to examine their feet. What's happening with their toes? How are they being cared for? Can they walk? Comprehensive functional assessments of health in older age are significantly better predictors of survival and other outcomes than the presence of individual diseases or the extent of comorbidities. You have that really, really well memorized in your brain, that a comprehensive functional assessment can help them more, or it needs to be combined with your assessment of their chronic conditions. Here's an example of function at 93. I did a lot with my president's slide. I was very happy about it. It's kind of interesting that Jimmy Carter and George Herbert Walker Bush are the same age. Look at their functional differences. Now, Jimmy Carter, I know all this stuff because I'm a news junkie and a political junkie. Jimmy Carter was diagnosed with cancer recently and has been getting aggressive treatment for cancer. So he has a serious condition. But look at the difference in their function and the kinds of support that they need. I haven't seen a picture for a long time of George Herbert Walker Bush without his wheelchair. The difference in these two people from a policy perspective was we need to start talking a lot about how you provide care for someone who loses function to the degree that he has. He's very fortunate he has resources. Many people do not, because providing support for people with functional impairments is very hard. His conversation is about long-term care. Even if it's in the community or at his house, his conversation is about long-term care. These are very different people in terms of their health trajectories. The WHO report defines healthy aging as the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables wellness in older age, well-being in older age, maintaining functional ability. And they talk about that functional ability is made up of a person's intrinsic capacity. What can I do myself? How am I physically and mentally operating, as well as the environment? And I want you to keep the environment in mind. And if you talk to disability advocates, I don't know if you've had a chance to meet with them in any of your classes, they will tell you that it's not the disability that's the impairment, it's the environment. It's things around them that create the problem. I asked Terry yesterday or last week, do we have people who are visually impaired in this class? Because I've got a lot of slides. Functional limitations are really an impairment on someone's health, and paying attention to function for an older person. So the Atul Gawande story, the person that the geriatrician is worried about in terms of walking, they may be just fine on the first floor of their house, but the bedroom's upstairs and the washer and dryer's in the basement. So paying attention to environment at this point is really essential it's a risk prevention strategy for them as much as anything, as well as a functional strategy for how they get around. In the report, they talk about what's important to old people, and I was struck that this is important to me and important to you. A role or identity. This goes back to the ageism part where I say we don't expect things from older people. Older people still want a role or an identity. They still are themselves. They want relationships. This gets really fun when we're talking about sexual activity of older adults in nursing homes. Those are some fun issues to tackle. Because it's like you have like the triple whammy of older people and sex, and then you have to do HIV protection, and it's just like Wonderful to talk about. But you have to talk about relationships. The possibility of enjoyment. Everybody needs a reason to get up. And some of the most heart-wrenching programs I've seen for older people are the intergenerational programs. People with Alzheimer's disease or people with really quite significant physical impairment who have joy in their hearts and eyes when they're with children. And intergenerational doesn't just mean older people and kids. It can mean all generations. But a way to still experience joy, a reason to get up. Autonomy. That's why I hate that word keep. Older people value their independence more than anything else. It's what you value. It's that point of time where you're sure this is the last summer I have to live with my parents. I really need my own apartment. I am not going to live here anymore. When you're at the point that you want your independence, you will never let go of it. You will look at yourself in the mirror at some point and think, wow, how did this happen? But you will never let go of your need for independence, a sense of security, and possibility for potential growth. People still want to keep learning and doing. And to achieve these things, older people need the ability to move around. And I thought this was interesting because they're not talking about walking. They were talking about walking, they would have said walking. They're really talking about engagement, the way to move around. So if you're in a wheelchair and you can get around and you can ride the city bus and you can do your stuff, you can be your life, then you can move around. It does also mean the ability to walk, but it's much more comprehensive than that. Social isolation is a huge problem for older people. And at some point, I think in everyone's individual life, this may happen to you when you turn 50, you start to wonder, what do old people do all day? And what do they do all day? And what do they do all day if they no longer drive and they can no longer get themselves around? How do they spend their days? I mean, oh my God, I can't imagine watching that much television. I mean, just what do you do as an older person? The ability to move around. Social isolation is also a risk factor for elder abuse. Cognitive impairment, social isolation. Those are the big pillars. How do we maintain social relationship with people and help them stay engaged? To achieve those, they have to be able to have relationships, people in their lives, to meet their own basic needs. It's really important that we not just take over and do things for other people. So I mentioned my mother, because my parents are just now on this point of turning 80. My mom's a volunteer at Lawrence Memorial Hospital. Maybe someday she'll watch, so say, hi, Mom. She and I have been talking about people with disabilities. And she sits at the front desk, and you have people come in a wheelchair. And Mom has retrained herself on who to speak to the person who's the patient, not the person pushing the chair, to talk to the patient. At least start there. How are you? Why are you here? How can I help you? And if the person can't respond, certainly the person with them can. But older people still want to meet their own needs, learn and grow and make decisions and contribute. Evidence suggests that focusing primarily on their intrinsic capacity is more effective than prioritizing the management of their specific diseases. And it's not to reject disease management, but to underscore that it's their physical and mental capacities that should be the targets of intervention. And addressing those and their environments in which they live will help ensure their services are most relevant. So here's a very busy chart. And then I'm going to do some Q&A with you in a minute. This is my second to last slide. These are 3 common periods of intrinsic capacity. I'm not going to look up there, I might. The first one is if you've got someone with high and stable capacity. This is, at this point, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. The risks and challenges, you need to be able to look for emerging NCDs. The goal should be to maintain their capacity and their resilience of the individual. You need to encourage healthy behaviors. You need to detect chronic diseases. You need to build resilience. So this is about, in a lot of ways, prevention. How do we keep them as capable as they are? But once the capacity starts to decline, and they're becoming more frail or becoming more diminished, having more sensory impairments, then we have to look at what we're going to do to continue to manage as much capacity. Can we reverse or slow the loss of capacity? And how do we address this? They're now starting to fall. Oh my goodness, the first fall. You saw once, you're going to start falling. And this is moving you into the second category. And when there's a significant loss of capacity of performing basic tasks, then we have to figure out how to compensate for it. They can no longer drive. What will we do to help people get around? How do we provide support? Long-term care, and this is the area that I enjoy working on most, is the area of long-term care from a policy perspective, because it's a big mess, and it's fractured, and we haven't figured out how to pay for it. And I've been in kind of stupid conversations in the past about whether long-term care is healthcare. Is long-term care healthcare? It's like, well, half, and the other half is social support. But you have to continue to pay attention to the health of people when they have declining capacity. In the very corner down here, we're talking about palliative end-of-life care, which is the work we focus on at the center. How do we continue to kind of follow the person, change the supports to keep them healthy to the very end? All right, this is my final slide, and I really would like to do some Q&A. And I'm giving this slide on behalf of my 80-year-old parents. The most dismissive thing their doctors say is at your age. I can't tell you. I mean, we could poll all the older people, this happens. This is a really common thing for doctors to say. Well, at your age, and that only feels dismissive to an older person. And it makes them mad, it offends them, so whatever important medical evidence or information you're about to give them is now clouded by this negative perspective you have. Now, at your age, because it often is, it's not worth it. You're not worth it. We're not going to do it anymore. At your age, we're going to stop. You shouldn't do that. Don't ever say that. It's ageist. Don't ever say to someone at your age. So my mom had a torn rotator cuff. The doctors kept saying, well, at your age, you're going to have arthritis. I mean, I think because we haven't broken aging down into these decades of category, the doctors actually just assume everybody's the same age. All old people have arthritis is the only thing they have, and it's just not true. There's a better and different way to get there. So I'm going to talk about my father. My father is 80 now. He had a heart attack when he was 62. He was in Denver at the time. And right after the heart attack, they went in, they did a stent. He had another partially blocked artery that they watched. And for several years after that, he would go in and they would do the treadmill tests, additional testing, really kind of watching. Well, then he retired and he moved to Colorado. And he was in Colorado. He moved to Texas. They're over in Lawrence. And they're worried because he's got pain right here. And no one has done one of those tests for him for a long time. So he went to see one doctor. Well, I want to do a test. I mean, I've got this other blockage. I never knew what happened to it. We stopped monitoring it. And the doctor said, at your age, we don't do that anymore. Well, then they talked to me. It's like, they're saying all the crappy things you would expect them to say. It's like, why are we being disregarded? He went to see a cardiologist who handled the same information in a completely different way. He said, you've survived 18 years. You're a survivor. At the time when you had this heart attack, what the medical standard of care was, I'm sure he didn't use that language, but the medical standard of care was we did treadmill tests. We monitored this often. We don't do that. Medicine has changed, and we don't find that to have been that helpful. You have survived for 18 years. You are a success. And if you want for me to help you monitor this and see me once a year so we can keep an eye on things, I'm more than happy to see you. And the change in that went from my father feeling at your age, you're not worth it, it's dismissive, to being proud to have survived for 18 years with coronary heart disease. He has been a survivor. And how you help people get to that point is the most important part, is that you help people understand their own value. You're there to support their value. And everything you do that approaches them from an ageist perspective erodes that. And that's really not your goal as professionals, and it's not what your patients need to hear. Let's do some Q&A. That's my last slide. Thank you all for being very attentive. Let's talk. Let's talk.
Somebody have a question? Back here.
Over here.
And then I'll get up there.
So thank you so much for that talk. My question's kind of about long-term care because
Yes.
It's near and dear to my heart. I think a lot of us know that at least in my hometown community, we have a couple great facilities, skilled nursing facilities, but unfortunately there's not enough beds even now for people in our community who need that type of care. And I guess my question is, we know that, it's been talked about that that's only going to get worse as our population ages. And especially at the local and state level, it seems like it's talked about, but everyone just kind of brushes it under the rug, like, oh, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And I just think that's a real disservice. So I guess my question is, what, from your experience, is being done at a policy level to kind of change that? And furthermore, like, what can we do as future physicians to advocate for our patients who deserve high quality care regardless of their comorbidities and stuff?
I will try to give you a short answer, but if you'd like to order pizza, we could stay. We can just stay for lunch. The nursing homes, most of the nursing homes in this country are about the same age. They were all built in the early 70s. There's different configurations, hub and spoke, the H. I mean, there's just sort of like two architects who built them all or something. Do you know why they were built in the 1970s, in the early 1970s? Medicare and Medicaid. So we have had this issue as a society for a very long time. How do we help older people? But the structured solution of a nursing home was in response to payment policy at the federal level with Medicare and Medicaid. So that's why they look like they did. And they were built to look a little bit like Dr. Bill Thomas, who's just leading geriatrician in the field. He talks about them as being a cross between a prison and a hospital. And they really look like that. I mean, they weren't really designed, those old model nursing homes, as any sort of like good place to live. It also started to medicalize the approach. Just the physical place started to medicalize the approach. The changes that have been happening, and this has been happening in this country for several decades now, when Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they would have been called HCFA at that point, started to provide support in the community for people who are on Medicaid and develop other opportunities for people to be cared for at home. The first thing you pay for when you move to a nursing home is the first thing you pay for when you go to college and you move into the dorm. It's room and board. You go to a nursing home, you're going to have to pay for room and board. And really, they're there because they need the services. So if people are already living someplace else, how can we deliver services that are high quality and help people age in their homes? That creates all kinds of ripples down the system, needing more healthcare providers who provide services in the home and payment structures. One of the biggest fallacies, or not maybe fallacy, but just misunderstanding, when we're talking about Medicaid policy for older people. In all of the other contexts about Medicaid, we are talking about people who are low income. When we talk about Medicaid and long-term care, it's different. We built these systems that are too expensive for people to afford. And you have people who retire, they start drawing their state retirement, they start tapping Social Security, and their monthly payment, their monthly income of $3,000 will not pay for the cost of a nursing home. They're upside down. Kansas and Missouri handle this differently. In Kansas, they can be eligible, and a lot of people on Medicaid in Kansas who are older are the middle class, and they have resources. And I think that what the policy needs to change is we need to spend more and more time on community-based services. We need to increase the prestige, the salary, and the professionalism of the people providing care. And we need to help people retain their money as long as possible before they spend down to Medicaid. It's very complicated, and there are some pioneers, they're called that, kind of the Pioneer Network, in nursing homes who are coming up with a different model of care. I'm not anti-nursing home. I would reduce their footprint, if I could kind of rule the world, increase their payment, have fewer of them that were better, and serve a lot more people at home. Clear at the back, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about, I know a lot of geriatricians and primary care providers are switching to quality-based compensation models, and a lot of them have been huge advocates in terms of cost effectiveness and outcomes on the well-being of their patients. What is your philosophy or outlook on that model?
About changing the quality measure model?
Yeah, going from fee-for-service to quality-based.
Right. Okay, let me name three things and I'll stitch them together. Okay. We have community services. like let's just name Meals on Wheels. It's not the only one, but everybody knows it. We have community services. We have long-term care services, and we have acute care services. Two payment models that are moving in the direction you're talking about are the accountable care organizations, CMS has been funding, and managed long-term care, like we're having in Kansas in the Can Care program. Or I guess they'll add a third, Medicare Advantage programs through private insurance companies. Those models that are capitated payment models can be driven differently with outcome measures, but they're offering, the mix of things they provide to a patient needs to continue to expand. You would think that through an accountable care organization, you could have a different kind of social consciousness about the people in your region because you're responsible for their health. But to do that, you will need to run this trajectory. You'll need to go from thinking about medicine to thinking about health to thinking about wellness and bridge all of those together in a payment model. I was at HHS when the ACOs came out as part of the Affordable Care Act, and we were very hopeful that some of the community services that are evidence-based could be brought into this fold, and that hasn't happened. It still needs to happen. There are evidence-based community supports, and I think that this, like, someone didn't get the memo that while we were building an acute care model, we actually improved the services we could provide. And there are evidence-based programs for all of these chronic diseases and for caregivers that would help improve a health. Who will pay for them? An ACO should or could, but hasn't yet. This is the nature of some of the other work actually I'm doing here in Kansas City. How do we get higher quality community services into this mix to help the healthcare providers? So someone with diabetes, 25% of people on Medicare have diabetes. So if you write a script for the insulin or whatever support, how you're managing the A1C, we can implement an evidence-based program to help manage the diabetes at the YWCA or the YMCA. Who will pay for that? Someone should pay for it because it'll produce a better outcome. And that's still where we're having struggle, bridging the payment model to include some of these other services. Do you have a Jayhawk hat on?
I do, yeah.
I can spot it a long way away.
Rock chalk.
Mm-hmm.
So
hey, can we talk about something completely different? Are you ready? So, here we go. On my bucket list, I want to see them in a bowl game. So you all need to help me live a long time.
Yeah, that might not happen in
I
our
know.
lifetimes.
57, I got, 30 years before I can still get up.
Good thing we're living longer, though. So a two-part question here. In our country, we're seeing an increase in the retirement age, and a lot of times this goes hand in hand with sort of a bad connotation of that. But is this really something that they would, older people actually want? And furthermore, when the workforce is valuing younger and quicker work, how do we increase the old age acceptance while we simultaneously have an increased desire for competitive business efficiency? And with that, is this purely fiscal responsibility or is this textbook ageism?
Okay, you had a lot in that question. I'm trying to figure out where to tackle it. Some of it is textbook ageism. Some of it is an assumption that older people can't learn or won't learn. And there's evidence that older people still can and will. The changing retirement age is a different conversation, and it's very fluid. Are we talking about changing the age that people get Social Security or Medicare? Because that's one policy conversation. Are we changing how long people want to work? Are we talking about employment policies that allow someone to work part-time? The longer I have worked around and in the field of aging, the more confused I've become about what retirement is. And I think this is a very positive outcome. We no longer are living in a world, and you all will not be in this world, your parents are not in this world, where at 65 you get the gold watch and a pat on the head or the shoulder and say thank you. That world is very fluid. And there are a lot of social scientists and others in the field of aging who write about that what health has given us as a country, and this applies to people with disabilities as well, not just people who are aging without them, is age of 50 to 75. This is the healthiest cohort of this age group that we've ever seen. This is my cohort. These are the people who have incredible expertise and experience and want to provide a meaningful contribution. And some people, many people, someone will have the financial ability to walk away from a structured paycheck, but want a way to be involved and continue to give, whether that's paid or unpaid involvement. The federal government has quite a number of older workers, and you can pull data to show this. And I was the manager of them. And when I started, I had 2 people working that were in their 90s. I thought that was a little extreme. I felt like they had aged in place. But there are people in this federal system who would like to retire, but the monetary system with regard to accessing their pension won't allow it. So we have to change some of the policies to say, you need to kind of ramp up. Oh, how many of you work fast food? I mean, I was terrible at it when I was 16. I really was very bad. I had to mow yards, I could do that. You ramp up when you're younger, and what's starting to happen now is you ramp down. And how do you do that and maintain the skill set, the value? I don't believe, my value, other people don't agree with me, that older people have to step aside. I think we have enough need in this economy that older people can continue to contribute, and you all can still get jobs. I don't think it's a competition among generations at all. So.
Kathy, we just have a minute or two, but could you say just something about what certainly is one of the most pernicious forms of ageism, which is what we referred to as elder abuse, and what these physicians in the future might see and do regarding patients who seem to be survivors, victims of elder abuse?
Okay, thank you. It's my favorite topic. 1 in 10 older people are abused. Most situations of abuse are not reported. Financial exploitation is the fastest growing section of abuse because of what I talked about earlier. Older people are having cognitive impairment and they have resources. What you need to do as doctors is see it and screen for it. There are different types of medical tools. From a policy perspective, the great thing I tried to grab, and I never got there, was getting Medicare to pay you to screen for elder abuse. There's some reasons why I never got there, and part of it is the science is still trying to figure out how to hand you a short enough screen that you can use in a doctor's office. The shortest validated one now is about 6 questions, where you ask someone about their safety. One of the leading geriatricians in this work is Dr. Laura Mosqueda at USC, and she has some wonderful videos online talking about what healthcare providers should do. You need to be forensic scientists. You need to take off someone's shoes and socks and find neglect, bruising, poor care. You need to lay down any naive sense that we respect elders, and that's the only way to come at this problem. There are a tremendous number of older people in this country who are abused, neglected to death, beat. There are women in their 90s and 80s who are sexually assaulted, and we don't do those rape kits on them. I mean, you just need to understand physically that this happens. This is what I could spend the rest of my career on, and I've spent a great deal of time on. One of the biggest problems that we have when talking to both law enforcement and healthcare professionals is a sense that if you call Adult Protective Services, you've done what you need to do. And I would like to just implore upon people to do that, and can you just care plan with this person? Almost assume that Adult Protective Services is not the solution, because mostly they're not. This is a prosecution pathway. You need to deliver health care. You need to do case assessment with older people. Do you know who most of the abusers are for older people? Their family. So I did domestic violence work back in the 80s. Back then, we're still doing this, we had to convince law enforcement to separate people, to do the interview. In a traditional male to female violence situation, we'd say, can you kind of not interview them together? If you see a patient who's with a caregiver and you never see the patient alone, how will you ever learn what else might be going on? I think we need to set up trust relationships. We need to be able to physically examine the patient by themselves and do a forensics exam. Laura Mosqueda has a lot of great information about what the blood tests can show, malnutrition, other kinds of problems. I would love to engage with you all more and talk about elder abuse. I have standing offers from some of the leading geriatricians in the country that if we ever want them to come, they'll come. So if you want to talk about elder abuse in grand rounds, let's get the experts here to teach you as doctors what to do. It will increase because we've got more older people coming, and it's tremendously behind in terms of social movement. We're decades behind where we need to be on the problem.
Thank you, Kathy Grenlee. Please
Thank you.
join me.
Thank you all. Good luck in school. Good luck to you all.